very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening for our very first Twitter Space event for the Equality Trust. The UK's inequality is among the highest in the Western world, far higher than any other European country with monarchies such as Denmark, Sweden or Spain. And I just read today that no other European country has a coronation of their monarch. And in fact, Sweden stopped doing this, and they ceased the continuation of the coronations in 1873 on grounds of expense. So it's a wonder why we're still doing them with such an enormous expense attached to it. The UK's inequality is damaging all parts of our economy and our society while creating enormous profit for the richest few. We can only solve or begin to solve our struggling economy and hurt communities by making our society more equal. So this leads us nicely on to the event this evening. The Equality Trust campaigns for a more equal society that works better for everyone. And as part of this journey, we've opened up this space this evening to discuss and consider whether abolishing the royal family could make the UK more equal. We want to look beyond the extravagance and expense of the coronation and consider the extent to which the existence of and financial support to an unelected head of state creates and perpetuates inequality in the UK. So the structure of this evening's event is that we have two speakers here with us who will share their expertise with us. I'll then open the floor to questions from the audience, and I think there's also a rolling Twitter feed box where people can put questions in the chat box if they'd prefer to have them written in rather than requesting the mic to ask the questions themselves. The system does allow you to request the mic, so please do so if you have something you'd like to put forward to either of our speakers. But it'd be quite good if we could please just wait to the end after we've heard from both of our speakers this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Laura Clancy. Laura is a lecturer in media at Lancaster University, and she's the author of Running the Family Firm, How the Monarch Manages Its Image and Our Money. Tonight, she'll be sharing her views on how the royal family impacts upon entrenched inequalities of income, wealth and power in UK society, and exploring what role they play in reinforcing these. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to talk about the monarchy and inequalities quite broadly. I think it's really important for us to think about, people often dismiss the monarchy as something quite archaic and something quite old-fashioned, and until very recently, when the mood has changed, I think, it's something that doesn't really matter. It's part of the status quo. Why should we bother about it? When I was writing my book, I kept being told, there's much more important issues to be worrying about than the royal family. But actually, I would argue that it's not symbolic power that they have only. They also have, significant material power within society. And it is something that, if we want to talk about inequalities, I would say we can only do that if we talk about abolishing the monarchy, because they're so central to all of those systems. So one of my kind of key arguments in my book is around how they adapt to different forms of capital and different forms of power over time. So of course, hundreds of years ago, they were funding slavery voyages and, the colonial voyages to various countries around the world. And that was how they made quite a lot of money. And they still have, all of the jewels and all of the art and so on that was stolen at that time. And that's a significant portion of their wealth. And what we see now is how they've adapted to this kind of neoliberal, late capitalism, where they have things like property empires. So the monarch and the monarchy are the biggest landowners in the world. So they have these various property portfolios like the Crown Estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, the Duchy of Cornwall. And these are huge, huge portions of land and property across the UK that are run like any other kind of property empire. So they build on the land, they develop the land, they've built loads of like retail parks and things that were very lucrative. And the land, the Crown Estate owns the whole of Regent Street in London, which, if you think about the rent from that, that's pretty incredible. So it's not just that they symbolise a particular kind of inequality, because we're meant to believe this family is more important and more powerful than all of us, but they literally uphold systems of material inequality by holding all of this land that, if we got rid of them, could be portioned out perhaps, or whatever else we might want to do with it. I mean, they also have political power, perhaps not in the kind we might imagine a few hundred years ago, but things like the Queen's consent, for example, or the monarch's consent now, I suppose. So that the Guardian have done really good work in unearthing systems where they're approving laws and getting to look at laws and policies before they become law when it concerns them. So when it's about their land, for example. And also weekly meetings with the Prime Minister, the little red box documents, they're really kind of plugged in to these systems of the state. And that kind of knowledge, right? That knowledge is a form of power, and that influence is a type of power. I think, they also hold up systems of inequality. So, there's that saying that the British are obsessed with class. But is it any wonder when we have this family at the head? And then we have, around that, these systems of aristocracy, for example, and how these two areas, the monarchy and the aristocracy, uphold each other through kind of vested interests, or friendships or relationships, having children between families and things like that. So how these systems uphold each other. The monarchy is hyper visible in lots of ways, but the aristocracy gets to continue as relatively invisible under that kind of veil of monarchy and the morality that we might attach to monarchy. And it's interesting, this event is called "Would Removing the Royal Family Make the UK More Equal?" And I think there's a distinction between, the monarchy as an institution and the royal family and the individuals within it, and what they do for that system. Because there's a morality attached to that idea of family, I think, that doesn't necessarily get attached to something like the monarchy, which is more of an institutional issue. And then two final things. So I think it's a global monarchy. I think that's really important. It's not just a monarchy in the UK. Various countries around the world still have the monarch as head of state. Barbados left recently, as we know. Lots of countries have said they're going to follow suit, and I think that's something to watch in terms of the kinds of inequalities that might arise and how that might then pan out across the UK. And of course, the approval ratings across the UK are very different. So Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, for example, are much less positive about the royal family than we are in England. Or I am in England, sorry, I'm in England. And young people are much less likely to approve. So we can see these inequalities starting to happen in approval and how people feel about that. And then one thing I think what I'd like to talk about is this idea of protest and protesting the monarchy and anti-monarchy feeling. And I think that's something that has been quite taboo over the years. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn and how he was treated as kind of a vocal, one of very few vocal anti-monarchists. And there's no, UK media platform, mainstream UK media platform that offers an anti-monarchy position. But also, more perniciously, I suppose, what we saw at the weekend with the literal arresting of anti-monarchy protesters in London, and what that says about, systems of consent. The monarchy would traditionally be thought of as, running by public consent, and that's how it operates. But maybe something else is happening where, we're not allowed to protest that. I'll leave it there, I think. Thank you.
Sorry, apologies for that crashing. That was extremely interesting and illuminating. Not to ask you to fill while I quickly get the other people back on, but if you wouldn't mind talking just a little while I quickly sort out this admin issue, just so the others don't have to wait in complete silence for me.
Yes, no worries. I guess the other thing I had on my notes, which I didn't mention, which we can maybe quickly talk about, is ideas around whiteness. We're talking about kind of symbolic power in terms of race inequality, but also in terms of, what kind of Britain we want to be. And there's some really interesting research by a colleague at Lancaster, Michaela Benson, that she's done interviews with people who have moved into the UK or have moved out of the UK since Brexit. And kind of their understandings of what the monarchy is, which is really, really interesting in terms of how they don't see themselves reflected necessarily in these royal events and how they find it quite exclusionary. So I think that's another thing that I didn't get a chance to mention, but perhaps we can bring up in the questions. These systems of whiteness, and we can see that, of course, with someone like Meghan Markle as well.
But I will head straight to our next guest. And just a reminder, if anyone online has anything they'd like to ask Laura, please do feel free to drop it in the chat or to wait until the end and request the mic, and we can open the floor up to you. So on to our second speaker this evening. We've got Frances Foley here, and she is the Deputy Director of Compass. And Compass is a member-led, not-for-profit organisation for those who want to build and be part of a society where equality, sustainability and democracy are not aspirations but a living reality. Compass are most well known for work around a progressive alliance, e.g. campaigning around PR and devolution. So Francis will be speaking this evening on democratic alternatives to the royal family and how the discussion around the monarchy could feed into wider discussion around democratic renewal, for example, House of Lords reform, written constitution and electoral reform. So thank you very much for joining us, Francis, and over to you. No worries.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for having me and setting this up tonight. And like, full credit to you guys for trying something new. Every time we try something new at Compass, the first event is just a bit of like working it out. So yeah, full credit. And this is a cool way of running things. So yeah, props to you for doing that. So yeah, as you said in your introduction, Compass is an organisation which works for a more democratic, sustainable and equal future. And we do that by primarily working across party. So we're a progressive organisation, but since 2011, we've been a membership organisation which has been open to all parties. Before that, we were a membership organisation within the Labour Party. And the reason I say this to start off is because I think democracy increasingly has become kind of golden thread of what we do, and we've done a lot of work around campaigning for PR, change of the House of Lords, change to devolution, decentralisation in the UK, and all of that is to preface what I'm saying, which is that that's what we see as the fundamental root out of a lot of the crises that we find ourselves in, whether to do with the political systems or political outcomes. And so what I want to say about the monarchy tonight is really, I'm not going to stand here and make some prescription about what we should definitely replace the monarchy with. And I say that because I think we're still at the stage in the UK where we've not quite even diagnosed the problem properly. And I think what Laura, previous speaker, went through was just really, really helpful in kind of educating and opening up this wider conversation about the power that the monarchy do have. Just anecdotally, over the weekend, I was at the protest at Trafalgar Square. And part of that was just cathartic, kind of being amongst other people who have Republican sentiment. And part of it was also then afterwards to kind of have conversations with my friends and family about why the monarchy is still important. And I think actually I've been kind of disappointed and frustrated about the kind of lack of conversation around this. As Laura alluded to, there seems to be a bit of a conspiracy of silence around it. I mean, in a very literal way, because people were stopped from protesting and a peaceful demonstration was prevented from going ahead, but also because people don't see it as a top priority. And to just take a step back and context set for a second, I think part of that is because actually in the UK, we have one of the most stable systems of government in the world. We've had a very long and stable democracy, and we've not had many changes of regime in that way that other countries in Europe have experienced. Now, a lot of people might look at that and say, actually, that's a really good thing. And of course, it has brought substantive benefits to us as a UK population. But of course, also what it has done is meant that the roots of a kind of establishment system in the UK have grown very long and very deep. And they've also become very entangled. And I'll say a bit what I mean by that. So, you know, we kind of had our revolution, as I like to say, before it was cool. And I think we had our revolution of kind of 200 years before anybody else on the continent was really thinking about it. And the interesting thing about that is that we've had a much longer system for the idea of monarchy to become entrenched in our sort of national psyche. And I think what this has then done has, in effect, also kind of been absorbed into our politics. And the way that you can see that is in very structural ways. So, for example, the continued existence of the House of Lords, but also the existence of, you know, the Church of England and its power within our modern state, which is, you know, we like to see ourselves as a kind of very pluralist, sort of open, maybe even quite secular country. But of course, the Church of England is firmly at the heart of our systems of power. And of course, actually, if you want to look to party political structures as well, especially the Tory party has long links with different parts of the monarchy and obviously landed gentry and aristocracy. So what that continuity has done for the UK is create a kind of line through of the people who've held positions of power and privilege within the UK, continuing to be able to hold those powers and those to be actually ossified within our structures. So to bring it right up to the modern day, I think what we saw on Saturday was the kind of coming together of two things, as Laura already said. You've got still quite a strong culture of monarchism. And I thought the Guardian editorial, if nobody's read it from Saturday, was excellent in sort of saying the king needs the public more than the public needs the king. And for that big celebration to happen very publicly, involving, you know, thousands and thousands of people, if people just hadn't turned out for it, it wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't have been anything. It's completely depends on the public. So this is why the public conversation around it, the national discourse, is so vital. And also, the second thing is obviously police overreach, and we can talk about that in other spaces, but I think that is so crucial to this question about who gets heard and what arguments are understood to be politically viable or politically acceptable. And so where I finally end with this is kind of to say, whilst I wouldn't make a strong prescription about, of course, there's been lots of conversations about whether we should have an elected head of state, and that would be certainly something that I personally would advocate. But I think more interestingly is to start at that point of getting people to ask those questions. So what I wanted to ask of the people going along to this, which obviously was a kind of big display, it was a historical moment. I don't want to take away from people's feeling of significance around that, but to ask them, what are the values do you think that are on show here today? One of my favorite chants from the day was, Charles is he's just a normal man. And I think that spirit of egalitarianism should run through democracies which take themselves seriously as democracies. So back to Tony Benn's 5 questions, you know, what power do you have? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you use it? To whom are you accountable? And how do we get rid of you? And I think on all of those questions, the monarchy either delivers quite alarming answers or delivers none at all, especially to the final one. So the final point I'll end on is what Compass would like to see in relation to this question, as in relation to a whole host of other democratic questions, is firstly opening up this conversation, but not just to have people be heard, which is hard enough at the moment around this question, but also to bring the people into this process of deliberative decision making. We've long argued for a citizens' convention or a constitutional convention, as some call it, and in fact, when I wasn't working at Compass, I spent a year kind of designing what that might look like. A national level citizens convention, which would look at a lot of these constitutional questions, similarly as they've done in Ireland. It can be done to great effect. You know, that constitutional convention brought in equal marriage and changes to abortion legislation, and also then demand that this is on the agenda, that we look at this as alongside the House of Lords, maybe a written constitution, devolution, and a change to the electoral system. So what I just want to say is that I think there are lots of different competing arguments for the prescription to what might come after it. And of course, those are important. But what I really want to do is inject more debate into this whole issue and more people into this whole issue so that people feel they have a sense of agency over how they're governed and the process of power and decision making in this country. Thanks.
Oh, Frances, thank you so much. It's really interesting, really helpful, and great to get some kind of different lenses and different ways to kind of consider, you know, what's happening and what could follow. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. If anybody's got any questions, please do the requesting the mic business, and we can come to you, or you can put something in the Twitter chat and we can come to it there. So some of the things I'm kind of listening and hearing from both what Frances and Laura said, and you know, from the kind of previous interim question that we asked around, you know, what's happening what's still happening with Brexit and the constitution there, and the kind of no clear pathway forward from that situation, is that any change is going to be a long time in the coming, and you know, potentially another referendum and lots of kind of citizen discourse of what, you know, what's important to us as a nation, and what we want our head of states, you know, how we want that to look. So that's, you know, we're talking years and years in the coming there. So a kind of question maybe to both of the speakers, and then maybe to the floor here as well, is, you know, is there something we can do in the interim? Could we have a pared down monarchy while we're considering what the actual future might look like? Do you think that sounds like, you know, it could create a more equal United Kingdom while we're waiting for a kind of final perfect solution almost? Should I put that straight to Frances? We've just had you on, Frances. Go to you first.
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. And I think you're right to say that, it's not enough to just sort of point to kind of some distant future. And actually, British politics is seems to be a big fan of kind of incremental change. Sometimes that change happens alarmingly slowly, but actually sometimes it happens very quickly, as we've seen around things like Brexit. And sometimes, feelings and movements and energy gathers momentum over a certain period, and then they get an opportunity. And I think that's where I think we could be at on the monarchy, because I think obviously there was a lot of conversations when the Queen died last year about the whole period that she'd overseen, and how we actually did see quite big changes both to the monarchy, in the way that it was viewed and the status it had in society, and of course to society itself. And what I'm interested in that is for us to look at ourselves as a country in 2023 and say, does the idea of the monarchy and the reality of the monarchy, as Laura's already kind of spelled out, really make sense to who we are in 2023, and is it who we aspire to be? And so, to directly your question, I think a really simple thing would be to say, let's look at the wealth and land that the monarchy hold and begin a process of transition out of that into more a ceremonial role. Now, of course, the ceremonial role leaves untouched that idea of symbolism. But of course, when the symbolism has something material behind it, as Laura talked about in great detail, that has real substantive implications. And I think you might well see that under Charles. I'm not actually entirely pessimistic about the changes we might see in the coming few years, because I think that Charles himself understands he's not necessarily the most popular figure, in comparison certainly to his mother. And so I think, but that really puts the onus on Republicans or people who don't feel that the monarchy represents them to be raising these questions, and also to chart a path out of where we are, which I think has to start with taking away some of that material power.
Thank you. Can I just ask a separate question on top of that before I pass over to Laura? So I was really interested to hear you kind of say that maybe the first step is looking at and evaluating the wealth and the land that the monarchy holds. Do you think it's the right time as well to kind of look at the wealth of 177 other billionaires in the UK, or do you think we should do the two things separately, or is it worth looking at wealth overall, wealth and income, wealth tax for everybody, or look at the monarchy's kind of structure separately? Do you think it's too muddy to...
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And of course, I would be in favor of pushing to look at the questions of wealth in general. But I wonder if that's a sort of more strategic question. The answer to that sounds like a bit of a politician's answer, but depends on your audience. So for people who are already kind of on board with the inequality as a problem, and the way to solve that is also to look at the rich rather than focusing on the poor, that's certainly something that I believe. Then you can make that argument very strongly and say, actually, sort of the monarchy is the best possible, the kind of apotheosis of all of that, is like the best possible example of everything brought together, of wealth, power and privilege, which, let's point out, is completely unearned. You can't get more unearned than being born into this position. Yeah. But I think for some people who maybe still hold some sort of sentiment towards the monarchy, or still feel that they have a kind of cultural role for us, it might be worth just restating what we've already said tonight, which is that this is not just a symbolic role, this is a material role, and that question of how they get that role and how that is then exercised. And I think around that, it's very difficult once people start talking about it and claim to be in some way egalitarian, or think that democracy is an important thing, to say, well, sitting astride this democracy, you've got somebody not only who is very, very wealthy, but who is on paper at least very powerful. And I think just on that point about power as well, I think I've heard from some people coming back, well, actually, the monarchy is not that powerful. And firstly, I would like to very much contest that, both in terms of constitutionally, obviously they have a very clear role, but the answer to that is we just don't know how powerful they are, because they operate behind the scenes. And so for a lot of people, and I think that strikes a chord with a lot of people in terms of this inequality point, is to say we don't know a lot of what the monarchy are doing, because a lot of it is shrouded in secrecy. And when we try to call it out, I mean, for example, they're not subject to FOI requests. That is a big issue. We can't find out actually what they're doing. So I think that's something where you can tie these things together and work out with whoever you're talking to, there's something in there that you should care about, whether it's the wealth, whether it's the access to power, or whether it's this symbol of really gross inequality.
Yeah, and the unearned position. Yeah. So Laura, can I come to you now and go back to that first kind of initial question about, in this interim period where we consider, what our next stages might be in this role of head of state, would you be in favour of looking at a pared down monarchy, and would a pared down monarchy help the UK's kind of fight against inequality?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. And I like the idea that Francis just said about kind of incremental change and how that might be more palatable. Yeah. I think that last point Francis said, I think, was excellent, and is really true, that we just don't know, and people don't know. So even you can't calculate their wealth. It's impossible because of the way that we can't get access to their wills. We don't know, how do you calculate what the crown jewels is worth? Like all of these hidden systems of, they own some things in as a position as a monarch, and it passes immediately down. They own other stuff they own personally. Like, it's really very complicated. So to me, kind of the question would be, we could try and have a pared down monarchy, but like what would you cut, and how can we find out in a fair, transparent way what there is to cut, and where we can make gains in that sense, I suppose. Yeah. And I think that's a really, really complicated question that would be quite difficult to answer. I also think that, they've talked for a long time about how they're going to start doing a slim down monarchy. That's been doing the rounds for 10 years or more. And we've seen very little in terms of actually doing that, I think, other than like cutting Prince Andrew, but even he's worming his way back in.
Other than so nature taking its course.
Exactly. So I think, I'm very cynical, sorry, but I wonder, to what extent that's kind of lip service say, we'll pare it down, whereas versus, okay, but what are you actually going to do and what you actually going to give back? And I think, that point around, they know they're unpopular, but I don't know if they do. I don't know if he does know he's unpopular. If you think of, I think they're very inward looking. So if you think about how they've responded to requests about, looking at their colonial history and their slavery history, Prince Edward literally laughed in the face of someone who asked for reparations. Like, they've got no sense of their own position within that. And if all they need to do, literally all they need to do, is hire someone from the outside and say, okay, we're going to do a little project that looks at our colonial links, and people would be happy with that. That would not everybody, but that would solve a lot of problems. But they won't do that because they don't look outwards, and they don't seem to understand what the public discourse is, because all of their staff are so tight within the system. They all sign and non-disclosures. It's not necessarily that kind of forward looking in the way that we might expect, I don't think.
Yeah, they're above scrutiny almost, isn't it? And I just wondered, actually, do you think that's why they don't pay inheritance tax? Because otherwise we might be able to work out how much money they own.
Well, yeah, probably. That's, I mean, they've been exempt from that for hundreds of years, but because it's sovereign to sovereign, so it's separate from they separate the natural body of the individual versus the crown as an entity, and that's the distinction. But you would be able to work out how much they own. Yeah.
So we've got a question. Thank you so much for those answers, both of you two. We've got a question here on the chat. We need to discuss and think about the process for national discussion. What are the speakers' thoughts on how to do this? So that's from Liz Crosby. Liz, is that about, setting out the parameters for, potentially a referendum or something like that, I'm guessing? So what are the speakers' thoughts on how to go about discussing the process for national discussion on, the next stage of a head of state?
Shall I go first?
That sounds great. Thank you.
So I think that the first stage is kind of a more general education around the monarchy and what it is and what it does. Because I think that particularly around kind of their wealth and what they do pay and what they don't pay, and what that means in terms of land and blah blah blah. I think all of that isn't common knowledge. I'm kind of quite surprised often by what people do and don't know, because we're not it's not in our mainstream media, all of this information, and it's not taught to us in schools, and all of that. So I think I've been thinking about kind of education for like young people, in terms of what the monarchy is. I think that would be a really good place to start, and just kind of having the conversation. I mean, that's crazy, but we literally don't have that conversation in this country, around kind of their wider meaning beyond the individuals and beyond that kind of celebrity culture, symbol, national identity conversation. It doesn't go further than that. So I think as soon as you start pushing that conversation of, okay, this is what they are, and this is what an alternative might be, and it doesn't mean you're going to get President Nigel Farage. It might mean, something much better, actually. So those kind of, conversations to get people involved in, I think, would be a good start.
Thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Francis?
I think Laura really nailed it. As I said earlier, I think that we're not we're not in a place right now, it seems to me, that where a lot of people actually see this as a key issue, and it's very much part of the wallpaper. And what I think more of us should be able to do is start these conversations. I mean, I was surprised just anecdotally at the weekend I started this a conversation with some people I expected to be very anti-monarchy and to be understanding of the position monarchy hold. And actually, they weren't. They were neither that knowledgeable, it seemed to me, about the monarchy, nor were they that passionate about it. And they're people who I otherwise would expect to be in terms of the other kind of political issues that they care about. And so I just think that the more that we can actively talk about it, and we don't all have to, it was cathartic at the weekend to have a chant and a rant. And as I said to somebody on Saturday, today is not a day for nuance. Like, certainly the other side isn't showing it. But I will say that, like, most of the time, you can enter into deliberative conversations with people about, the way that they see it. And actually, I will say that some of it is about understanding what position monarchy is holding for people still. And I felt that very strongly about when the Queen died, because whilst I'm a very staunch Republican myself, like, I did understand that this was a moment for the country's kind of, this idea that people would have a moment and had a shared experience, I think is important. And to look up, the feeling of wanting to be part of something bigger is really strong within a lot of us. And I think we need to kind of acknowledge and accept that. But of course, I would like it to be something which was not such a symbol of kind of obscene unearned wealth and privilege. But to hold on to that sense that people want something to feel part of something bigger, a way of connecting with each other. And things can feel quite abstract, but I think, I never wanted to look down on that need, because I feel that very acutely too, just on a personal level. And to connect with that on an emotional level, and to say to people, but is the monarchy really the right vehicle for that? Is it the right place to sort of dock those emotions? Yeah. Isn't there other ways that we can connect and talk about things like, even conversations about our country, what kind of country we want to be, open up the conversation and say, does the monarchy really reflect that, both in terms of its structures and institutions, and actually, to be honest, in terms of its personnel, right, the actual people. And so I think that's the sort of conversation we can begin to have. And I think also then we can depersonalize it, because I think something we haven't really touched on tonight is the celebrity role that the royal family hold. And I think Laura made an important distinction earlier, where she said there is a distinction between sort of the monarchy as an institution and the royal family. And I begin to decouple those things, because people like celebrity, and that is fine, but these are celebrities who also wield, as we've discussed at length, really like untold wealth and material power. So how can we say there's a place for sort of celebrity, but actually the problem about that celebrity is it's not harmless. It's like re-entrenching this idea that these people are significant and have, an importance within our society. So I think all these different ways of coming into the conversation are where we should start. But just keep talking about it, basically, because it's never going to go away unless people chip away at it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things actually that I really struck me, like with the coverage that I did kind of catch leading up to the coronation and after and during, was just all the conversation that I saw seemed to be, the great pride in this is what Britain does best. And, watching it, you kind of think, really, is that the best that we can say about our country, is that we can put on a parade? It just felt, not the thing I'd want to have pride in, and not the debate I wanted to be having. There just seemed no room for anything other than gloss. Do you know what I mean?
But then I also think that a lot of that is media.
Yes,
a lot of that is media gloss. Because actually, I was also I was at the protest on Saturday as well, and there were a couple of royalists who were like pretty aggressive. Actually, that was the most aggression I saw. But there was also a couple of people who were like giving thumbs up and were quietly supportive of it, or quietly interested in it. And I think, more and more people are kind of recognizing, the Queen was like a certain form of status quo, right? And I think more and more people are seeing what it actually means because that status quo has been disrupted. And I think I've long thought, I haven't done actual research for this, but my assumption for a long time has been that most people are pretty ambivalent, and just kind of think, okay, it exists. It doesn't really matter. What are we going to do about it? Rather than being like really staunch royalists. And in a way, that's obviously good because I think, the BBC would want you to believe everybody's really into it. And I don't think that's true. But the other side of that is, how do you address ambivalence?
Yes.
And how do you get people to have that conversation? So I think it goes both ways. But I do think that what you said, that one-sided conversation is totally manufactured by the media, and isn't actually borne out, I don't think, in most conversations with people.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. So just a reminder to anybody that you can put your questions in the chat box here, or you can request for the mic to come to you, and then we can put them to either or both of our speakers here. Just another kind of look at, if we're looking specifically about the monarchy / royal family and inequalities, or entrenched inequalities in the UK, obviously if the monarchy was abolished and we had some other way to kind of elect a head of state, how do we make sure, or do you have any ideas or kind of suggestions of what approach that we could adopt to ensure that the replacement system doesn't entrench inequalities, but just in a different way? So I'm kind of thinking particularly, about the amount of money it costs to kind of front a campaign to go towards being elected head of state. Is there any kind of other magic cures or magic wands or approaches that you can look at to make sure it's not just the rich and wealthy, but from different families that are kind of getting elected? Francis, should we put that to you?
Yeah, sure. So I think I mean, it is a complicated question, not least because as we look at our own MPs who are elected, and as you kind of alluded to, the amount of money it takes to be elected an MP is not insubstantial. But I think there's sort of two ways of looking at this as well. I think on one level, I think that the good news about what I was saying earlier about a system which is extremely stable is when a big change does happen, it really opens people's minds up to the possibilities of what could be. Because I think a lot of, as Laura was saying, a lot of what people feel about the monarchy, a large number of people, I think, do feel ambivalent. But they also just feel, oh, well, it'll never change. And I almost think that's the biggest obstacle to a lot of the political and structural changes that we at Compass are working for, whether it's the voting system or it's the House of Lords or it's a written constitution, which would themselves be like structural changes, but they would also be cultural shifts as well. And they would hopefully move us towards greater equality and greater democracy and more equal distribution of political power. And so the reason I say that is because if there's an opportunity for having a conversation around it, which is actually going to lead to outcomes, so I mentioned earlier the Citizen Assembly, it really throws up this whole idea of like, okay, well, who are our elected representatives? What sort of mix of representative versus deliberative democracy might we want in this country? So I point to one of our closest neighbours in this island, and I mentioned them before, but I really think that was a very powerful example of a country saying, let's do a reckoning of kind of where we're at right now. And they started by obviously having a series of citizen assemblies which looked at constitutional issues. But of course, what you saw with that was that it gained its own momentum outside of it. So for those of you who don't know about it, they had citizen assemblies which were then followed up with referenda. And you had a series of, you had one referendum on equal marriage and you had one on abortion legislation. But these were also opportunities for people to talk about what they thought should be rather than what just is. Yeah. And so I go back to that question of, yes, we should absolutely talk about how to stop entrenchments of power and privilege happening. But when you have a big moment for a change like that, I'm relatively confident and optimistic that if enough people were brought into the process, you would end up with quite a good outcome. And I'm not necessarily saying what that outcome is, but I think as part of that if you chose to move towards an elected head of state model, you would have people thinking about, well, hang on, what are the barriers to people even getting elected in the first place? You would be allowed to talk about it, and you would be allowed to get at it. And I think the political party that decides to take this on will reap the fruits. And I think, as you saw in Ireland, actually, it was the people who passed through this legislation, many of them got re-elected, and it was incredibly popular. So take a chance on people, take a risk. These deliberative settings are very well facilitated. They're extremely well prepared. They have good evidence around the world of coming up with a really amazing outcomes, which solve a lot of these entrenched political problems that we just think are never going to change.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And it's really interesting to, consider that perhaps, just a simple approach as opening up the floor and letting, as many people as possible having some kind of input and giving people the permission to imagine their society and how that might be different and what that might look like and what that might mean for them as, citizens is, really empowering and could be the direction that's needed, really, isn't it? Rather than the same old institutions protecting their own interests, creating laws and ways that perpetuate that, isn't it? So thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that answer, Laura?
No, I think that nailed it. I think the only other thing I did an event last week with Anthony Barnett, who's like a left wing. He's written about monarchy for many years, and he was saying that for him, any move towards kind of anti-monarchy, republicanism would need to come with proportional representation. But I guess that's part of what Francis was just saying really well about how it's, it wouldn't just be, you wouldn't just get rid of the monarchy and everything else would continue the same. It would be a massive, massive cultural, political, and social shift. That would put exactly these different systems in place. And I guess discussions around Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and their parliament and that in relation to Westminster and all of those questions as well.
Thank you. So I've got a question here on our chat. So I think part of this might have been answered already, but we'll go with it again and maybe we could look at some other examples. So are there any relatively modern examples of countries that have made a successful transition to a republic? So you mentioned Ireland there, Francis. Have we got any other kind of examples or even learnings, or is there anything we can learn from the Russian Revolution and stuff like that for what might be a good starting point for discussion for the UK?
I mean, Barbados is the obvious example, I suppose, and that's still very new, isn't it? So they're still working it out, but I also think other countries are going to follow suit fast. So I think by the time we eventually get around to this question, which as much as I'd like to say it'll be tomorrow, it's not going to be. It's going to be a long time. We're a long way off, I think. But by the time we've got there'll be plenty of other examples of how they've kind of made that work. So I think those will be there.
Yeah. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think Laura's mentioned it, but I think that's what's interesting is seeing this conversation in like former Commonwealth countries. I mean, as someone sort of said to me bitterly the other day, like even the word Commonwealth is an interesting one, right? What's common about the wealth? Well, very, very good point. And obviously we're seeing that happening at speed actually now. Even though I think it's being less reported on than it should be. But of course, you've had other countries outside of that who have made these sorts of shifts and transitions, notably a number of European countries. And I think, as you say, like, they sort of begin to disentangle the sort of ceremonial, symbolic role that dignitaries play and the kind of material wealth, power, and influence that they also have. Now, I am also questioning the kind of ceremonial role to some degree, but I think until you found spaces to express that kind of cultural heritage and questions around, how do you do ritual and tradition in a way that's inclusive, you can at least make gains by, as we've talked about, thinking about wealth and material and land. And I think land is actually the one I'm most interested in the UK, because I think there's real interest now also about questions about, you're seeing kind of obviously with stuff like mass trespass recently, questions about land usage. And of course, it has deep linkages with the monarchy and the aristocracy. And I think getting at land, which has obviously always been a kind of a very radical thing to talk about in the UK, given how sort of old our entrenched systems of land and ownership are. It would also open up really interesting, very, very topical questions around land use in reference to things like rewilding, and thinking about climate, and thinking about shifting rate of agriculture, and thinking about housing. It opens up channels to loads of different political topics, which are really acute topics that a lot of people care about. So if you can shift those conversations onto that, you maybe think about transition from another angle, rather than just talking directly about the monarchy. You can think about talking about it from that perspective. Well, of course, we can't do X, Y, and Z because the monarchy actually owned that land. Oh, I didn't realise. And then you've opened up a conversation, you know.
Backdoor conversation. Nice one. Thank you. So another question here on our chat: has anyone done any statistical analysis with regards to countries with royalty versus those that don't, and how unequal they are? Well, I think maybe the first thing to kind of highlight here is that I think it is officially the most unequal country in the world is, you know, America, which is famously a republic. But obviously we're fourth most unequal in the world, and so we are a republic. So I'm not sure it always follows down necessarily down those kind of entrenched republic versus monarchies. But has anybody else, any of our other speakers or anybody else on the call, got any insight they're able to add to that question?
I'm not aware of any studies on that. I guess one context of that, though, is there's obviously very different versions of monarchy around the world. So at the Thai monarchy, for example, right, you're talking about a very, very different setup that leads to a different set of inequalities, I think. I guess that's my only kind of caveat to that, but I'm not aware of any big studies.
Yeah. Francis, are you?
I don't know of any. I'm sure. I'm probably. They should exist, or they must exist. I'd imagine that they do exist. But one maybe paralleled point to that would be, to me, to also think about. You know, we've touched on it a few times, but this question about what kind of equality we were talking about, and I sort of presume that the listener might have been talking about sort of economic material inequality. But of course, to me, one of the biggest questions about this is. It is about actually the power position, and I almost try to take that first, the question of inequality of power, and inequality of access to decision making, because it seems the most kind of egregious and obvious. And actually, you know, there's this chance on Saturday, which I firmly joined in with and agreed, but you know, you're saying things like what a waste of money, and you know, things about like get a real job and stuff like that. But I think the most important thing actually is this inequality of access and access to power and decision making, and actually changing the course of what happens in this country. And I think from that, other things like economic inequalities flow. So without being able to access, for example, policy around land use or wealth tax or inheritance or anything like that, how do people begin to shift the balance of power economically towards greater wealth distribution? So I think if you target the political power question, you target, you know, the basis of our hugely economically unequal system.
Yeah, and I think, you know, well, one of the things for me, I don't know if everyone's in the kind of same situation, but I think I believe the rhetoric of it's, you know, just a figurehead, and it's just, you know, they you know, they're quite a benign force, the monarchy. They don't actually have any power. They don't do a lot. But I don't, you know, weekly meetings with the Prime Minister. I mean, how can you not have power when you've got access to that kind of, you've got a firm date in the diary every week to the most important person in the land? You know, it's crazy to think that they're just a benign force really and have no influence at all. So I think that's certainly an eye-opening kind of situation for me. So just looking through our chat box here, I think we've exhausted our questions from our listeners. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It's been a really interesting evening, and sorry for our early tech issues. And to Francis and to Laura, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise and your insights and your, creative ideas, and opening the kind of doors of creative thinking. So what might be in the place of the monarchy that we've got, and new ways of considering and looking at things, and working towards making a more equal United Kingdom, which I think is something we're all very much interested in doing. So thank you so much for your time this evening to look at that, and thank you also to everybody that's joined us.
I just want to say thank you very much for hosting it and for trying something new. It's been a great format, and despite the difficulties of this, I think it's really great to have this space. So thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for doing that.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. It would have been fantastic to go through a few extra questions that we have in the chat, but I'm afraid that is our time for tonight. But if you do want to explore the topic further, don't despair. You can find out more about the topic of the royal family in the UK, for example, by reading Dr. Laura Clancy's book, Running the Family Firm, How the Monarchy Manages Its Image and Our Money. You can find out more about that on her website, laura-clancy.com. Or you can find out more about the work of Compass and their Deputy Director Francis Foley at compassonline.org.uk. Their Progressive Alliance in particular proved pivotal in the most recent local elections, and they have a lot going on. And of course, you can find out more about what we're up to at our website, equalitytrust.org.uk. In particular, consider signing up to our website. We send out a newsletter every week which has a briefing on what's going on in the UK and the campaign to get a more equal, just society. Thank you all so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your evening.